Okay, take it away.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I guess this is Alan Saylor with EAS Consulting Group. I'm the Senior Director of Food Consulting Services, and I want to thank you for joining us today. This was a bit unscheduled, so I know how busy everyone is, and the fact that we went a little long last week, we felt really we wanted to give that opportunity for those that wanted to hear a little about building blocks for an effective food safety program. And so we're going to cover this. I know we had a half-hour schedule. This is probably going to go slightly longer, but I'll try to be efficient with the time. So, first of all, this is really about identifying what are the risks, the food safety risks for dairy products and the dairy processing industry. How do we know that? Well, if you've been around as long as I have, it is almost intuitive. You just hear from others, you read things, and I would encourage you, by the way, if you are not subscribing to some of the free dairy trade publications and food trade publications, please do so. We've got a list. We aren't going to post it or anything, but if you are interested, that list has ways you can subscribe to some of these journals and professional magazines, and you will also see EAS authoring some of the articles in these magazines. But let's get to the point of what are the risks? And the risks most people think about are microbiological. So broad-based food in general, what is causing foodborne illnesses in the United States? And this is data from 2016 to 19, so it's somewhat recent. In fact, about as recent as you're going to get from the government. And if you look, the number of illnesses are in order from top to bottom. So Campylobacter, which many people thought was just a bad flu everybody gets over, and then they found out that it causes other things years later in some people that have gotten Campylobacter and seem to have recovered. And it can cause some very serious things like um, oh, um, Guillain-Barré syndrome, things like that. And who knew that Campylobacter, this innocent bacteria that made us sick for a day or two, and then left, could do that. Salmonella, we know pretty much about. It's most commonly associated with poultry, but it's also associated with reptiles and birds, um, wild birds. Shigella, Yersinia, Vibrio, all interesting. Listeria is right before the parasite. So what is Listeria's claim to fame? Well, Listeria's claim to fame is the fact that it has the lowest number of infections over that given time period of 2016 to 19, but it's got the highest percentage of hospitalization. 98% of the people that got listeriosis from whatever food they ate went to the hospital, and 16% died. That's the highest rate of deaths. So listeria is one of these things where if you happen to get it and you get sick enough to go to the hospital, you may very well end up dying from it. Many of us, particularly middle-aged adults, have an ability to resist it, and we probably don't go to the hospital. Okay, things that make us sick. Dairy is in this particular set of information, Consumer Reports 2015, 11% of the foodborne illnesses were caused by dairy products. I didn't think it'd be that high. Also, another thing, illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths of the illnesses during in CDC, about 13, almost 14% of the foodborne illnesses were caused by dairy products. 16%, we're at the top. When you get foodborne illness, dairy is more likely to send you to the hospital than many of these other foods. I find that strange and unusual. I would have expected the fresh fruits and vegetables to be in that top category. But in deaths, we are third behind undetermined and poultry. Okay, let's look again. FDA a few years ago implemented a requirement, we could call it a voluntary reporting program by the industry. And FDA has been very, very good about not taking aggressive enforcement action if industries don't report. But I don't think you want to think you have the option of not reporting. And so over the last few years, this is voluntary information reported to FDA. So it's really important that we look at this. And what does this tell us? This tells us that for dairy, these are the number of reports. This is nothing, no percentage, but the number of reports of problems, reportable events are problems. They could be biological, bacteria. They could be chemical, could be cleaning compounds, could be something else, or they could be physical, things like little pieces of metal or wood shavings or something accidentally finding their way into these products. So this is what it's captured. And if you note, we go somewhere between 10 as a low and 24 for a high. Or I'm sorry, yeah. And so we've had 88 total. If you look at fresh produce, which is kind of the bellwether, the ready to eat fresh produce is one of the few categories that actually has higher levels of reportable incidents. So if you keep going on, there we go. This gives us a little, what are the reasons why these companies made a report to the FDA reportable food registry? And in fiscal year 2010 and 11, you can see Salmonella is top, allergens are a close second, and then Listeria is maybe not such a close third. But as we move toward the present, and unfortunately we have no reports since fiscal year 2014, which was reported in 2015, we're starting to see allergens taking over the dominant role as the reason for reporting a reportable event, which usually means there's a recall associated with Salmonella second and then Listeria third. And this continues to this last reporting. It would be very nice if FDA invested some resources in compiling the reports for 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, but we haven't seen those yet, as far as I know anyway. If anybody knows of it, I'd love to hear about it. Okay, we're starting to get some sense of where the risks are, what causes the problems in dairy products. And this is what this presentation is about. So more information. Now let's look at biological, chemical, and physical. And there were data from the CDC as far as foodborne illnesses. This is not dairy specific. Testing 1, 2, 3. Are we hearing me? I hope you're hearing me because I just had a beep on my headset. So I hope that doesn't mean something went awry. Anyway, the biological, chemical, and physical CDC did not capture any physical. Now, that's not to say that physical little pieces of things in the dairy products are not a problem or in foods. It's just they don't capture it. And then chemical and biological. What is the issue about physical? Physical is determined to be a hazard primarily from the point of choking or laceration of the esophagus as you're swallowing things. And so that is between 7 and 25 millimeters, which is roughly 0.7 and 7 to 25 millimeters, which is about a little larger than 1/4 of an inch to about 1 inch. If you swallow something of that size, there's a good chance you'll choke. Or if it's a metal, sharp piece of glass or metal, you'll cause injury. So again, what are the top 5 CDC pathogens in foods that cause illnesses? We start at norovirus, go all the way down to Staphylococcus aureus. When we go down to hospitalizations, the order switches a little. Salmonella drives it, even though in the 2016 and 19 data, actually we saw that Listeria was the top driver to hospitalization. So as you look at different data sets, you get different things. But what causes the death? And we have the likely culprits again: Campylobacter, Listeria, and Salmonella. Toxoplasma gondii, that's another issue that I could spend a half an hour alone talking about. We're not going to really talk about it here for dairy products. It's not that applicable. So in order to build a effective food safety program, we have to know about risk assessment. So this is one of these mysterious, we use the word a lot, but do we really understand what it is? Well, it can be quantitative, which is how many deaths per year in a given population from hazard A that was consumed and found to be in product Y. So how many deaths do we have from, I would say, Listeria in drinking milk in a given year? How about soft cheese? That's what we're talking about, quantitative. Qualitative is categorization, small, low, medium, high risk. And that's what we do mostly in the dairy industry when we're trying to determine hazards and build an effective food safety program. So a risk assessment is generally, we don't have frankly, the knowledge, experience, capability of, or or expertise of people that can really do a good job of quantitative risk assessment. That's usually done by the government, okay? But risk assessment, given that the US FDA, CDC, USDA do their own risk assessments, we take that and then we try and manage the risks that they identify. And the way that we do a risk assessment, or they do a risk assessment, is they identify the hazards, they characterize the hazards, they figure out exposure assessment, which is really a lot of mathematics, statistics, gathering data. Sometimes when the data isn't there, they have to do estimations and guesses, and then they do a risk characterization. In food industry, we can use a number of different things to evaluate the likelihood or the severity of the risk, and that's coming up very quickly. So the risk is probability or likelihood, that may be a term you use, to versus severity. When you can plot probability or likelihood and severity, you will get some type of a risk value, whether that is quantitative or whether that is low, medium, or high. So here is a little bit for those of you that really want to be more of a purist in using the right terms in the right situations. In the industry, we're responsible for managing risks, okay? We're not expected to do a risk assessment, although I will mention that in some of the new, not so new now, FSMA regulations, the term risk assessment does appear. And please understand, they're not expecting us to go and hire expensive consultants that are experts in quantitative risk assessment, but they are asking us to make some judgments about qualitative. Is a risk, foodborne illness risk, high, medium, or low? Okay. And where do we get this? We can get it from government data. We can get it from industry information. We can get it from consumer organizations sometimes gather data like that. We can get it from journals and scientific articles, peer-reviewed articles. And we can get it from experts in the industry that may just know a lot about the risks and the hazards of a particular food. Now, one of the things that's going to help us determine the consequence and the likelihood, or severity and the likelihood, is these organisms. When do they grow? When do they not grow? When do they die? And so this is a table that FDA published in a number of documents. Seafood HACCP, that doesn't mean this is just for seafood. It was published in the training manual for the preventive controls for human food. If any of you took a PCQI or preventive control qualified individual course and you received a certificate, you will have been exposed to this. Let's look at Listeria, since that's the one that seems to be a bit on the dangerous side, although any of these, under the right circumstances, could cause illness or injury in a food if it was consumed. Listeria likes cooler temperatures, and we refrigerate most of our dairy products. This is why we tend to find Listeria to be the most common problem, if there is a problem, microbial, in dairy products, because we refrigerate most of them. It also has some tolerance to salt. So if you look at the water activity, it can survive into one of the lower water activities other than Staph aureus. Staph aureus is commonly found in cuts and scrapes on humans, and if we're not careful and we don't wash, put on Band-Aids, or if we're in a food processing environment, we don't really want to use Band-Aids, maybe we have to use gloves or some other covering. Staph aureus grows in wounds, and hopefully it doesn't proliferate, but it can get into food that way. So foodborne pathogen limiting. Okay, so if I know what causes, what their sweet spot is for growth, what can I do to set up temperatures and times to stop their growth or limit their growth? So let's look at Listeria again. If you look at Listeria, which is kind of in the middle of the table, you can see that if you have Listeria at a temperature of 31 to 41 degrees, it will grow out, and the amount of growth it'll double its numbers in 7 days. If you put other bacteria, pathogens at that 31 to 41 degrees, they're going to get almost no growth. It doesn't mean they're dead. It doesn't kill it, but it stops the growth. And growth, sometimes the numbers of pathogens that you ingest has a direct impact, not sometimes, always a direct impact on how sick you'll get. Okay, so this is a good reference. And now, what about which foods? Okay, so we know about the bacteria, we understand a little about the chemical hazards and the physical hazards. Which foods are more likely to be associated with a foodborne risk? FDA just published a traceability proposed rule that Dennis Galsvig went through last week. And in there, FDA listed the foods that they thought were a high enough risk that there was additional record keeping for traceability needed. Now, this list could change. This is a proposed rule. I don't think it will change very much. Out of this list, cheeses other than hard cheeses are at the top, not because it's the highest risk, but because it is one of about 16 categories of foods. And it's so therefore, we know that soft and semi-soft cheeses, what's an example? Feta could be maybe a semi-soft, mozzarella, particularly cheeses in the US that there's an option where you don't have to pasteurize if you heat treat and hold them for 60 days. And this was put in place 30, 40 years ago when that was what we thought was safe. We recognize today that may not be, but the regulation has not changed. So therefore, we can produce some cheeses that are maybe semi-soft without pasteurization as long as we hold them for 60 days. Other cheeses do require pasteurization of the milk that is made. Okay, interesting. So where else can we find information that'll help us understand what the hazards and the risks are? Well, the Innovations Center at the U.S. Dairy, based in Chicago, is a tremendous resource. And so I put a hot link here in place, and one of the documents that they have is controlling pathogens in dairy processing environments. And I just captured one of the sections of this document as far as the table of contents. And so they have a lot of good information. I would encourage you. Another source is a document on the same website, slightly different web page, called Controllable Listeria Monocytogenes, Guidance for the U.S. Dairy Industry. Why? Because our products tend to be more susceptible to Listeria monocytogenes. Now, if we're talking about powdered dairy products, whey powders, milk powders, non-fat dry milk powders, we have moved the bar from Listeria to Salmonella. Listeria doesn't do well in dry products. Salmonella seems to survive. It doesn't necessarily always grow, but it survives in dry products. And so in there, they have a lot of the same information as the prior document, but they also go into other things like environmental pathogen monitoring. Why? That is like an early warning radar to what we might find in our products. If we're starting to find pathogens on our environment, in the floors, the drains, the outside of equipment, things of that nature, is it possible that they'll find their way onto a product contact surface and therefore into a product? The answer is yes. And so environmental monitoring is a tremendous tool in an effective food safety program, so much so that FDA has mandated an environmental pathogen monitoring program for the pathogens, the most pertinent pathogens for the particular food you're manufacturing for ready-to-eat products. Now, if you're not making a ready-to-eat product, most of our powders we make are intended to be used as ingredients in other foods. Does that mean, well, I don't have to do environmental monitoring? The answer is, from a government standpoint, yes. Is it still a smart thing to do? I frankly wouldn't run a dairy plant today without environmental monitoring. Here's some other interesting pieces of information. They, as far as carrying out the environmental monitoring program, it's very important as one of the effective tools in the food safety program is knowing the traffic patterns. Where are people walking? Are people going from a raw area into a high hygiene area? without proper doffing and donning of uniforms, footwear that's changed, things of that nature. That's so important. You've heard about that today, or you've heard about that in the past before today. What about butter and powder plants? And where are the hygiene areas? And what they have done in this particular diagram is zoned the entire plant into low, medium, and high or high hygiene areas. And those high hygiene areas have to be protected. And there's much more environmental monitoring done there. So let us now get to the qualitative risk assessment. How do we do that? Well, a lot of people do it in different ways. You could just say low, medium, high, and make some intuitive judgments and record why it was, from a food safety standpoint, a high risk or a medium risk or a low risk. Now, from a business impact, the presentation today is not about the economic impact of food recall or anything like that. That's a whole different presentation. But you could use the risk assessment principles of high, low, and medium to assess business. We're not going to do that. This is all about food safety today. Here's the table I think many of you have seen, or at least some rendition of this, where remember what the risk was defined as? Likelihood and frequency versus consequence and severity. And so if you go from left to right, you have likelihood is common, known to occur, could occur, do not expect to occur, or practically impossible. Now, are these mandated? No. FDA doesn't say that. No one says you have to use those categories, but I found it to be very helpful and used it probably for the last 10 or 12 years. Likewise, if you go from top to bottom on the left side, you go from a consequence being fatal to the least innocuous, which is insignificant. Anyway, what you try and do is make judgments on the likelihood versus consequence, and based on the food, the circumstance, the facility, everything about it, and you come up with a couple of things. You come up with an A through E as you go vertically from top to bottom on the left. You come up with an A through E as you go from left to right at the top. Where those intersect is a number. This is the significance value, and the significance value, you can use the table at the bottom. Are we in a red zone, which means we could control this through a prerequisite program, or a CCP, or the modern vernacular today is we could use a preventive control. Yellow is today a CCP or preventive control. Preventive control should have been added. And then the blue is the lowest risk. You could call that low. So instead of numbers, it could just be all blue squares and low. And that's where you could manage this through prerequisites or some other control program. So yellow high, red medium, and blue, light blue low. When you use this particular table then you see the column likelihood score, that's an A, B, C, D, E. Severity score, that's an A, B, C, D, E. Significance then, I'm going to move back for a second, is the number or the color. If you want to really dial down, you could put a number in there. If you just want to say it's high, medium, or low, you can do that. So the significance would be the number or the high, medium, or low where they intersect. Then you have to identify the control mechanism. And if you've identified a hazard, particularly a hazard that is in the medium or high category, you better have control mechanism that is a preventive control or a prerequisite or a CCP. That's really the options. So let us look at some other types of control programs. We have to have a hazard analysis. That's required today by FSMA. So that's a given. And they have, they meaning the FSPCA in their training manual for PCQI has a very good hazard analysis table that is, is similar to this, but it has a little more detail because it has a justification column that isn't in this one. And it has the word preventive control. And what are you doing? Is a preventive control needed or not based on the significance score. So it's similar, but slightly updated. So if this was something you've had forever, this by itself, if you're selling a food in the United States, is not adequate anymore. It needs to be updated. Okay, let's look at what's below the tan bar that is about 1/3 down from the top. It's called written food safety fundamental programs or prerequisite programs. This is some of these could be SOPs. This is not intended to be SOPs. And I hope that is not talking in riddles here. But because of the time we have available, I did want to move through. Okay, so in the preventive controls for human foods that FDA is enforcing now in all food plants, do we need to have a program of personal hygiene? The answer is yes, we actually always have. It's part of a GMP. Does it have to be written? I suppose you could say technically no. We certainly encourage that it be written. And in the era of COVID, has personal hygiene taken on a slightly new dimension because now we're almost more concerned about transmission of disease from employee to employee than we are about foodborne. But we cannot forget in the era of COVID that we still need to make sure we do not, through poor employee hygiene practices, cause a situation where the bacteria is finding its way into the food and therefore making people sick. Okay, the next thing is preventive maintenance. Now, there's two types of preventive maintenance, and many of us have software programs now that tell us when we should be. I'm going to make this very basic, maybe for my explanation. Change the light bulb. When does the light bulb have to be changed? Well, at my house, I change it when it burns out. But in a food processing plant, you do not want lights to burn out, even though they do sometimes. Sometimes they're in easy to change places, not a big deal. Sometimes they're 15 feet up in the ceiling and it's over a bunch of equipment and you have to get scaffolding and you shut the processing down. So my point is, if you have equipment that needs maintenance, bearings need to be changed, other things need to be done, rebuilding, plan these things out based on manufacturer's recommendations and then do it, because sometimes what we find is that these unscheduled breakdowns where processing is partially or totally shut down is so stressful that everybody is focused on getting started up again. We forget some of the fundamental hygiene practices, like making sure all the equipment that was laying all over on the floor is cleaned as it's being assembled, then re-cleaned and re-sanitized before it's ever being used, and maybe even the first product is started, because who knows what got onto some of that equipment as it was scattered all over the floor. So preventive maintenance, equipment maintenance, and facility maintenance, really important. Next is storage, cleaning, and sanitizing of equipment. There's a whole presentation which will be next week, not this week, but next week, Thursday, on this whole topic. We actually need a written program on, this is one of the preventive controls, by the way, equipment, cleaning, and sanitizing. The nice thing about almost all preventive controls in the FDA preventive controls for human food is you don't have to validate them. You have to monitor the preventive controls and you have to verify them. But if you are using cleaning and sanitizing of equipment as your main preventive control between product changes from an allergen to a non-allergen, then this would have to be validated. It's one of the few where validation may very well be required. Okay, cleaning of the facility. I think that goes without saying. And how do we verify cleaning of the facility? We need a written program. And we verify it by our environmental monitoring. Well, what happens if we don't have products that are ready to eat? They are ingredients that will be used in other foods or other dairy products. The answer is we still recommend that you verify your cleaning of your facility and equipment with an environmental monitoring program. Integrated pest management. What I would suggest is that in most cases, let the pest control contractor write this manual for you. And they already have all the templates. They just have to customize it to fit your program. So I wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of resources to write my own pest management program. I would look at theirs, edit it to make sure it fits and addresses what you need, such as the frequency of monitoring, how many bait stations, where they're located, those kind of things. And we do need a diagram. I will guarantee you that while FDA doesn't require a diagram of where the pest control bait stations and those kinds of things are, SQF, BRC, IFS, and FSSC 22000, the GSFI third-party certification programs, they do. Okay, environmental monitoring. We've talked a little about that. You need a program that identifies all the potential environmental monitoring swabbing locations, and then the rotation, so that some areas may be swabbed every month. Others may be in a rotation where they're swabbed once every quarter. Others may be swabbed once every 6 months. That has to be determined based on the risk and the likelihood of contamination. Floor drains, I'd swab them every time I do a swabbing, whether that's once a week, hopefully not once a quarter. I think it's too infrequent. Now, what about foreign matter? Well, foreign matter is the physical hazard. This is where we need to identify what those hazards might be. And what are the hazards in a dairy plant? Well, metal, usually that's small shavings coming from things like pump impellers, valve seats, homogenizers, separators that are misaligned slightly. If the separator or homogenizer is misaligned, it's going to walk across the floor and through one of the brick walls. That's what usually happens, but it could happen where it's a small misalignment or something. Glass, we more or less are trying to get, if we haven't, we need to get all glass out of the processing areas, including thermometers. If that isn't possible, then we've got to be very careful and have a program. What happens if we have a glass breakage in a processing area? Wood is mainly from pallets. You should know about the 4 classes of pallets. There's a national standard, and there are certain types of pallets. The bottom pallet standard classification is essentially held together by chewing gum and baling wire, and I don't think you want that in your dairy plant. It's a little like pig pen and peanuts. Trails wood wherever the pallet is taken because it is so poor shape. We don't want that because small pieces of wood have a potential to find their way in the product. Allergen management, tremendously important. The new preventive controls in human foods in their GMPs mention allergen cross-contact 38 times. Do you think FDA is watching closely about this? We have to have a very tight allergen management program. What happens if we have, in dairy, we have milk? What if that's the only allergen? It's in everything. So, Alan, I don't need an allergen program. Well, it doesn't really matter what Alan thinks because FDA has said whether you have no allergens or all 8 allergens that are potentially being handled in your facility, or the same allergen in every product in that facility, you have to have an allergen management program. Employee training is all about food safety, and you have to document this. It says in the regulation that you have to have a PCQI overlooking the entire and managing the entire food safety program, and then you have to have qualified individuals that are responsible for various parts of the food safety program, and FDA will be checking. Now, granted, today they are not doing a lot of on-site on an as-needed basis only, but at some point, hopefully next year in 2020, as soon as possible, we will get through all of this and FDA will restart its domestic inspections and its foreign inspections. And please understand then that they will be talking to employees about whether they are qualified to do the job they're supposed to. So moving on quickly, temperature management, warehouse management, air and water safety, loading, unloading, storage, and transport. That, unfortunately, many times the individuals involved in these are entry-level people. They are not trained as well as they should be. They are probably not paid as well as they should be. And these programs for unloading, no truck should be unloaded if you are taking refrigerated products off until there's been a determination that the temperature of the product, not the truck, the product is adequate. The same with loading. When you are loading a truck, before you load it, the interior space should be at a temperature that you want the product to end up at. As storage, certainly on-site storage, warehousing, we require as a minimum either an alarm when the temperature goes below a target set level, usually around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or you can have a monitoring of a thermometer, or better yet, you have a chart recorder that gives you data when people are not there. Chemical inventory and secure storage. This is self-explanatory. A couple of things here. The mitigation strategies to prevent the intentional contamination of foods, which is one of the FSMA regulations, most of us call food defense regulation, does come into play here because not only do we have to keep a inventory, we have to manage and have a process for allowing new chemicals to come into the plant and taking chemicals off the list that are no longer used, but they have to be secured. So that's a requirement. I'm going to skip a few more. Calibration of the processing equipment as well as laboratory equipment. Calibration is important. Food defense, that again might fall, we could possibly put chemical inventory and all of that under a food defense program. Moving on, do we need an internal audit program? FDA does not mandate it, but the GSFI processing schemes, food manufacturing schemes do require an internal audit system of some type run by somebody that is trained and qualified to do so. Corrective and preventive action, absolutely required, and you need to document when you do it. Traceability, we just got that new draft regulation. What about recall? You better have a recall program. You better run mock recalls to make sure your team is up to it, and it needs to be as realistic as possible. Supplier management, this is 21 CFR 117 subpart G, and that describes what you have to do. Do you have your supplier take care of some of the hazards? Do you have your customer take care of some of the hazards and reduce the risk, or are you responsible entirely? Complaint management, FDA does want to see those. We would prefer to do trend analysis and show FDA or other government or third-party auditors our trends. Then we have document control, records control, and a few other odds and ends. So if we have all of this, and is this a lot of work? Yes, in some ways it is. But once this becomes the norm, you have modified the culture of your processing plant in a way that is going to significantly reduce the likelihood of a hazard getting into the food, whether it is foodborne, microbial, whether it is chemical, and by the way, allergens are chemical, drug residues are chemical, aflatoxins are chemical, or physical, wood, glass, brittle plastic, metal, those things. So with that, I think we have covered all of the things that I think are belonging in an effective food safety program. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will see if there's any way I can tell if there's any questions or if somebody would like to raise their hand.
I'm back on with you. I don't see any questions, but if anyone has a question, if you can just, since we have such a small group, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask it. Anyone? Okay, it doesn't look like it.
Okay.
So with that, I'll say thanks, Alan, and thanks to those who were able to join us. And I'll send a link on Wednesday with the access to Thursday's training along with Thursday's training materials. And we appreciate you joining us today. And Alan, you'll go ahead and end the meeting since you were the host that began it.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Amy, for helping out. Take care.
Sure. Thanks. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.